The moment Rosa Callahan rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she made herself a solemn promise that she would never again trust a man who wore a gun on his hip and a smile on his face, because the last one who had done so left her with nothing but a burned-down homestead and a heart that felt like cracked prairie earth after a long drought. She was 24 years old, and she felt considerably older. The town of Dusty Creek sat in the western reaches of Texas like something God had pressed into the landscape and then half forgotten about. There were maybe 300 souls living within its limits, a main street lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon that never seemed to close its doors, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind. Dust settled over everything with a kind of patient permanence, coating the hitching posts and the water troughs and the faces of people who had learned not to expect too much from life. Rosa pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the general store and climbed down with the careful economy of movement that came from having driven that wagon alone across 200 miles of Texas scrubland. Her dark hair was pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her green eyes sharp and watchful beneath its brim. She wore her father's old canvas coat, mended at the elbows twice over, and boots that had seen better decades. Everything she owned in the world was in the bed of that wagon, which was not very much. She had come to Dusty Creek because her cousin, a woman named Me, had written to her 3 months ago to say there was work available at the Creek House Hotel, honest work waiting tables and helping in the kitchen, and that the town was growing and decent enough for a woman on her own. Me's letter had arrived 1 week after Rosa's husband, Gerald Callahan, had ridden away with the deed to their homestead and another woman seated behind him on his horse, and Rosa had packed her things that same afternoon. She was done with men. She was done with promises. She was done with soft words spoken in the dark that turned out to mean nothing in the light of day. She had made herself this clear, and she intended to honor it. She found the Creek House Hotel without much difficulty and was greeted by Me, who was a round-faced, cheerful woman of 30 with flour on her apron and an enormous warmth in her dark eyes. Me had embraced her so fiercely that Rosa had actually laughed for the first time in months, a surprised and genuine sound that seemed to startle even herself. "You look thinner," Me said, holding her at arm's length. "I have been eating my own cooking for 200 miles," Rosa said. "That is its own punishment." Me laughed and pulled her inside, and the Creek House smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something savory simmering in the kitchen, and Rosa felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, like a knot worked by patient hands. She would be fine. She was always fine. She knew how to work hard, and she knew how to keep her head down, and she knew better than to let anyone close enough to hurt her again. She started work the next morning, and within 2 days she had the rhythm of the place settled comfortably in her bones. The breakfast rush, the midday quiet, the supper crowd that was mostly ranch hands and traveling merchants and the occasional family passing through. She learned the names of the regulars, kept the coffee hot, and smiled politely at everyone without ever inviting further conversation. It was a system that worked well, and it kept her at a manageable distance from the world. It was on her 5th day in Dusty Creek that she first saw Stephen Wells. He came in through the front door of the Creek House during the supper hour, trailing a thin layer of trail dust and the particular quietness of a man who had been alone on a long ride. He was not the largest man she had ever seen, though he was broad through the shoulders and stood easily 6 feet tall, with dark hair curling slightly at the edges from where his hat had pressed against it. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that needed a shave and hands that were rough and scarred in the way that came from years of genuine labor. He wore a gun belt, as nearly every man in Dusty Creek did, but he wore it with the casualness of something practical rather than the self-conscious swagger she had seen in men who wanted others to be afraid of them. He sat down at a corner table, set his hat on the seat beside him, and looked at the menu written on the chalkboard near the kitchen door with the focused attention of a man who had not eaten properly in some time. Rosa went over with her notepad. "Coffee," he said before she had a chance to speak, and then looked up at her and added, "Please, sorry, it has been a long ride." "From where?" she asked, and then immediately was annoyed with herself for asking because she did not want to know things about men in this town. "Laredo," he said, "delivering cattle up to a rancher north of here. The cattle made the journey without incident, which is more than I can say for my mood." Rosa almost smiled. She pressed her lips together instead. "The venison stew is good tonight," she said, "or there is fried chicken." "Stew," he said, "and a full pot of coffee if you can manage it." "I can manage it," she said, and went back to the kitchen. She poured his coffee and ladled his stew and carried it to his table and set it down without further conversation, which was exactly how she preferred things. He thanked her with a nod and ate with quiet focus, and she went back to her other tables, and that was the end of it. Except that it was not the end of it, because he came back the next evening, and the one after that. By the fourth evening he had been in Dusty Creek. She had learned, without particularly wanting to, that his name was Stephen Wells, that he worked cattle drives for several of the larger ranches in South Texas, that he had grown up on a small farm outside of San Antonio, and had come west when he was 20 after his parents had sold the farm and moved east to live with his sister, and that he was currently between jobs and looking to see whether Dusty Creek might offer something more permanent. She had learned all of this not because she had asked, but because Stephen Wells talked to her when she brought his food in the easy, unhurried way of a man who simply liked conversation and was not trying to be anything other than what he was. What she noticed, and what annoyed her considerably, was that he never made her feel like she had to talk back. He did not press for her story. He did not ask her questions and then lean forward with that particular hungry attentiveness that she had learned to recognize as men trying to find angles into her life. He just talked, and if she responded, he was pleased, and if she did not, he did not seem troubled by it. On the fifth evening he said, "You do not have to humor me, you know. I'm aware I have been rambling at you all week." Rosa paused in the act of refilling his coffee cup. "You have not been rambling," she said, and this surprised her because she had meant to say nothing. He looked up at her with brown eyes that were warmer than she had expected, and he smiled. It was not a charming smile, not the polished kind that men deployed with calculation. It was the kind of smile that had a little bit of tiredness in it and a little bit of genuine pleasure and nothing hidden behind it. "I am Stephen Wells," he said, and extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment. She shook it. "Rosa Callahan," she said. "Good to know you, Rosa Callahan," he said, and went back to his supper. She went back to her work, and she told herself very firmly that this was nothing. She told herself this for several more weeks. Dusty Creek in the spring of 1882 was a town in the process of becoming something. A railroad spur line was being extended toward it from the east, and the promise of that railroad had brought in new settlers and new money and new conflict, because land that had once seemed barely worth fighting over had become suddenly valuable. The Brecker family, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, were at the center of most of the conflict, because old Harlan Brecker had decided that several homesteaders sitting on land adjacent to his range were an obstacle to his expansion plans, and he had a way of making obstacles disappear. Rosa was aware of this in the abstract way that you became aware of the politics of a town when you worked in its hotel and listened to the conversations that flowed around you like weather. She did not think it concerned her, because she did not own any land and had no intention of owning any, because land was what Gerald had taken from her, and she was not ready to attach herself to anything she could lose again. What she had not accounted for was me. Me's husband, a quiet carpenter named Thomas, had filed a homestead claim on 40 acres east of town 3 years prior, and they had built a small house on it and planted a kitchen garden, and were in the process of adding a second bedroom in anticipation of the child Me was expecting in the fall. The land happened to sit at the corner of a boundary that Harlan Brecker wanted to push through in order to run his cattle to the new railroad spur without paying for right of way. Rosa found out about this on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, when me sat down at the kitchen table after the lunch rush and pressed her hands flat against the wood and said, "A man came to the house this morning while Thomas was in town. He told me we ought to think very seriously about selling." Rosa looked at her cousin. "What kind of man?" "The kind Brecker sends," me said flatly. "Big, not particularly interested in polite conversation." Rosa felt something cold move through her. "What did Thomas say?" "Thomas does not know yet. He was in town." Me looked at her hands. "I do not want to sell, Rosa. That land is ours. Thomas built that house board by board. We are going to have a baby in that house." "Then you do not sell," Rosa said. Me nodded, but her face was not convinced, and Rosa understood why. Understanding your rights and being able to enforce them were two entirely different things when the man threatening you had money and influence and enough hired muscle to make legal arguments irrelevant. That evening, when Stephen Wells came in for supper, Rosa found herself watching him with a different quality of attention. She had learned in the past weeks that he had been hired on part-time at the Maddox Ranch north of town, which was a smaller operation and not affiliated with Brecker. She had also learned that he was the kind of man whom other men seemed to respect without it having to be performed, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. She did not ask him about Brecker. That was not her place, and this was not her situation to solve. But she watched him, and she thought about what kind of man he was. 3 days later, she found out. She had taken her afternoon break and walked down to the far end of Main Street to post a letter to her mother in Kansas. And as she was coming back along the boardwalk, she came around a corner and very nearly collided with two of Brecker's men, who were standing outside the feed store and talking to Thomas with the specific body language of men making a point with their physical presence. Thomas was a slight man, gentle-natured and skilled with his hands, and he looked small between them. Rosa stopped without thinking, and Stephen Wells, who had apparently been coming out of the feed store at the same moment, stepped out of the door and positioned himself beside Thomas with the calm practicality of a man who had made a decision. He did not put his hand on his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, and the weight of his standing there changed the entire character of the conversation. "Something I can help with," Stephen said. The taller of Brecker's men looked at him with the evaluating squint of someone deciding how much trouble this would be. "Private business," the man said. "Looked like it was getting somewhat public," Stephen said pleasantly. There was a silence that seemed to weigh several hundred pounds. The two men exchanged a look, and then they walked away, and Thomas let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for some time. Rosa watched Stephen turn to Thomas and say something quietly, and Thomas nod, and then Stephen looked up and saw her across the street. He did not make anything of it. He just touched the brim of his hat in her direction and walked on. She stood on the boardwalk and felt the solemn promise she had made to herself shift slightly, like rock beneath a boot, finding new purchase. She did not say anything to him about it that evening at supper. She refilled his coffee and asked him if the venison stew was still to his liking, and he said it was, and the ordinary quiet of their exchange held something different in it now, something she was not entirely sure what to do with. What she did was bring him a slice of apple pie that he had not ordered, and when he looked up in surprise she said, "For this afternoon," and walked back to the kitchen before he could respond. When she came back to clear his table, he had left the exact price of the pie beside his coffee cup, and beside it a note that said, "You did not have to, but thank you." She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket, and did not examine what that meant until she was alone in her room above the hotel that night, lying in the dark and listening to the town settle into its nighttime sounds around her. She was falling for him. She recognized the sensation in the same way you recognized a storm coming across open country, that particular quality of the air and light that told you something was gathering whether you were ready for it or not. She had felt it once before, with Gerald, in those first bright, foolish months when she had believed everything he said, and had not yet learned to look for what was underneath the words. But Stephen Wells was not Gerald. She knew this the way she knew things that she could not fully articulate, through accumulation of small evidence. The way he treated the other people in the hotel, from me down to the young boy who swept the front steps. The way he talked about his cattle work, with honest acknowledgement of its difficulties and without inflation. The way he had stood beside Thomas not to be a hero, but simply because it was the right thing to do, and he was a man who did right things when they were in front of him. She was still afraid. That was also true. May arrived and brought with it the particular ferocity of a Texas spring, wildflowers rioting across the plains and thunderstorms rolling in from the west with tremendous dramatic authority. The railroad surveyors came through town and made their measurements and left, and the news of exactly where the spur line would run set off a scramble that thickened the air of Dusty Creek with tension. The pressure on Thomas and me escalated. A fence post on the boundary of their property was cut down one morning. Then a section of their kitchen garden was trampled, though there was no way to prove who had done it. Thomas went to Sheriff Barton, who was a decent enough man but not a courageous one, and Sheriff Barton made sympathetic sounds and wrote things in his ledger and did essentially nothing, because Harlan Brecker paid considerable taxes in this county and had considerable friends in the county seat. Rosa was furious in the silent, precise way that fury settled in her when she could not act on it directly. She scrubbed tables. She chopped vegetables. She lay awake at night making calculations and finding them all insufficient. On a Thursday evening in the second week of May, Stephen came in for supper and she sat down across from him. This was not something she had planned. She was on her break, technically, and the other two tables in the room were occupied by a traveling family and an old man named Herb who came in every Thursday for the beef and was completely deaf in one ear and mostly in the other, and the front room of the Creek house was as private as anywhere in town. Stephen looked at her sitting down across from him with an expression that did not make anything of it, which she appreciated. He simply waited. "Me and Thomas," she said. "You know what is happening with their land." "I have heard some of it," he said carefully. "Brecker is not going to stop. Thomas is not the kind of man who can fight this alone, and Sheriff Barton is going to go on writing things in his ledger until they give up and sell." She looked at him directly, because she had decided to be direct and she intended to be so. "I do not know what can be done about it. I do not know the law well enough to know what their rights are, but I know that you saw what was happening in front of the feed store and you did something about it without being asked." Stephen was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow, careful rotation. "You are asking me to get involved," he said. "I am telling you the situation," she said. "And I am asking whether you know anyone who does know the law." Something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in its neighborhood. "There is a land attorney named Caldwell in San Marcos," he said. "I worked for his brother's ranch 2 years back. He is sharp and he is honest, which is a combination that is less common than it ought to be. I could write to him." Rosa looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because your cousin and her husband are being pushed off land that is legally theirs," he said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "That is not something that should happen." She looked at him for another moment. "Thank you," she said, and stood up. "Rosa," he said, and she paused. "For what it is worth, you are the least intimidating person to talk to in this town, which is not what I expected from the woman who carried a pot of coffee like it was a weapon for the first 2 weeks I was here." She stared at him. He was smiling now, and it was the kind of smile that had humor in it without being unkind. She felt something warm move through her that she did not entirely welcome and entirely could not resist. "The pot is still available if you say anything else like that," she said, and walked back to the kitchen, and she could hear him laughing quietly behind her, and she was smiling by the time she reached the kitchen door. He wrote the letter to the attorney Caldwell that same week. He also, without making any particular announcement of it, began spending more of his time visible on Main Street during the hours when Brecker's men were most likely to be around, not threatening anyone, not making gestures. Simply present, in the way that a solid wall is present, because solid walls change what is possible in a space. Thomas noticed and told me, and me told Rosa, and Rosa thought about this for several days before deciding that she was going to stop arguing with herself about Stephen Wells. She invited him to Sunday dinner. She made this sound considerably more casual than it was, telling him that me had extended the invitation when they were standing at the hotel desk after supper on a Friday, and this was technically true, because me had extended the invitation after Rosa had suggested it. Stephen accepted without making any more of it than she had offered, saying he would be glad to come, and the transaction was completed with a minimum of visible significance. She spent Saturday in a state of mild agitation that she refused to name. Sunday dinner at me and Thomas's house was a vivid and crowded affair even with only 4 of them, because me cooked with the enthusiasm of a woman who expressed love through food, and the table was covered with roast chicken and corn bread and pickled vegetables, and a dried apple pie that made Rosa feel the particular warmth of genuine homeness. Stephen arrived precisely on time, with his hat in his hand and his hair combed, and a small jar of wild honey that he had found at the general store, and me received this gift with such pleasure that Rosa suspected she had already decided to like him before he arrived. The 4 of them sat around the table, and the conversation flowed in the easy way of people who had arrived at a similar understanding of the world. Thomas, who was quiet with strangers, found himself talking about his carpentry work in more detail than Rosa had ever heard him manage at a social occasion, and Stephen asked questions that were genuinely curious and not performative, and me refilled everyone's plates twice. After dinner, Thomas showed Stephen the frame of the new bedroom he was building, and Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them through the window, 2 men in shirt sleeves in the afternoon light, Thomas explaining something with his hands and Stephen nodding and asking another question, and she felt the precise moment when something in her chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time released its grip. She turned away from the window and started washing dishes, and me appeared beside her with a dish towel and said nothing for a while, which was itself a kind of commentary. "He is a good man," me said finally, quietly. "I know," Rosa said. "You are allowed to have good things, Rosa, you know that." Rosa kept washing the plate in her hands. "Gerald said he was a good man too." "Gerald was a liar," me said simply. "Stephen Wells is not. Some men are one thing and say another, and some men are the thing they appear to be. I think you can already tell the difference. You were always smart enough." Rosa did not answer, but she thought about this conversation for a long time afterward. Stephen walked back to town with her as the afternoon dissolved into evening, because the Wells house, which was really a boarding house room, was in the same direction as the hotel. They walked along the dirt road in the golden hour light, with the sound of insects beginning in the grass and the sky going amber and rose above the low hills to the west, and it was such a beautiful evening that Rosa stopped arguing with herself about everything and simply walked. "Can I ask you something?" Stephen said. "You can ask," she said, which was her standard response to that kind of preamble. "You came here alone. From where?" "A homestead in the hill country," she said after a moment. "Near Fredericksburg." He did not ask the obvious question immediately, which she noticed. He walked another few paces in quiet. Then, "You do not have to tell me more than that." "I know," she said, and then because he had waited and had not pressed and because me's words were still in her somewhere. "My husband took it, the homestead. He had debts I did not know about, and he signed the deed over to settle them, and by the time I found out it was done, he left shortly after." Stephen was quiet. She could feel him processing this with the same careful attention he applied to everything. "I am sorry," he said. It was simple and direct and contained no extraneous elements, no reaching for words to smooth over the reality of what she had described, and for that reason it landed more gently than elaborate sympathy would have. "I managed," she said. "I always manage." "I believe that," he said, and the way he said it was not merely consoling. He said it like someone reporting an observable fact, and she found that she wanted to believe it the way he did, without the accumulated weight of having had to prove it over and over to herself. They reached the hotel, and he stopped at the front step, and there was a moment where the evening held very still around them. "Thank you for today," he said. "Your cousin's cooking is remarkable, and Thomas is building something to be proud of." "They are good people," she said. "Yes," he said, "they are." He looked at her for a moment with those warm brown eyes in the fading light. "Good night, Rosa Callahan." "Good night, Stephen Wells," she said, and went inside, and stood just inside the door for a moment with her hand flat against the wood and her heartbeat somewhat louder than usual. June came in on a wave of heat, and with it came two things: the attorney Caldwell, who arrived on the stage from San Marcos, and an escalation from the Brecker operation that moved the conflict from pressure to something considerably more serious. The attorney was a compact, precise man named Leonard Caldwell, who wore his coat in the heat without apparent discomfort, and had the kind of eyes that were already taking measurements before he said good morning. Stephen brought him to the Creek House and introduced him to me and Thomas on a Tuesday afternoon, and Rosa listened from near the kitchen door as Caldwell listened to the whole situation, and then asked Thomas a series of very specific questions about the documentation of his homestead claim. Thomas had all of it. He was a careful man, and he had kept every piece of paper that had ever touched his property claim in a flat tin box under the floor of the house. And when he went home and came back with the box, and Caldwell went through its contents, something in the attorney's posture changed in a way that Rosa recognized as a man who had found what he needed. "Your claim is properly filed and properly documented," Caldwell said, folding the papers back in precise order. "Brecker has no legal basis for displacement. What he is doing is harassment at best and criminal intimidation at worst. If we can document the specific incidents, there is a case to be made to the county land commissioner that would effectively prevent him from continuing." Thomas and me looked at each other across the table in a way that said everything about what the past months had cost them. "What we need," Caldwell said, "are witnesses and written accounts of each incident." Stephen had already thought of this, Rosa realized, because he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Caldwell and said, "I began keeping a log 3 weeks ago. Dates, descriptions, and where relevant, names of individuals I was able to identify." Caldwell unfolded it and read it and looked at Stephen with the measuring expression of someone recalibrating an estimate. "You are thorough," he said. "I try to be," Stephen said. Rosa, standing near the kitchen door, felt such a surge of something fierce and warm in her chest that she had to turn back into the kitchen for a moment and look at the wall and remind herself to breathe. The escalation came 2 days later, when someone cut the rope on the well at Thomas and me's property, sending the bucket into the shaft and rendering the well unusable until it could be retrieved. It was malicious and deliberate and small enough that Sheriff Barton was comfortable classifying it as an accident. Thomas came to the Creek House that evening with the controlled anger of a peaceful man pushed too far, and it was Rosa who sat with him at the kitchen table while me rested, because me was 5 months along now, and the stress was wearing on her in ways she tried to hide, and Rosa was not having it. "We are not selling," Thomas said, more to himself than to her, pressing his fist flat on the table. "I built that house for our family. I built it with my own hands. That is not something I am going to hand over because a rich man wants to move his cattle through it." "You are not going to sell," Rosa said firmly. "Caldwell is working on the documentation. This goes to the land commissioner and it goes on record, and once it is on record, Brecker loses the ability to pretend this is legitimate business. He does not want that kind of attention." Thomas looked at her. "You sound certain." "I am," she said. "Because the law is actually on your side for once, and we have someone who knows how to use it." She believed it. She had not expected to, but she did. Stephen came by after supper that same evening, when she was sitting on the front step of the hotel with a cup of coffee and watching the main street lamps come on one by one. He sat down on the step beside her without being asked, which she noted he had never done before, and she noted also that she was not troubled by it. "Caldwell sent his first letter to the land commissioner's office today," he said. "He expects a response within the week." "Good," she said. They sat in silence for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silence between certain people becomes comfortable before either of them fully acknowledges why. "I want to ask you something," he said, and then corrected himself immediately. "And before you tell me I can ask, I want you to know that you do not have to answer." She looked at him sideways. "What is the question?" "Are you all right?" he said. "Not me and Thomas. You." She looked back at the street. A dog crossed slowly through the lamplight. A man came out of the saloon and stood on its porch, looking up at the sky. The ordinary texture of the evening moved around them. "I am learning to be," she said, which was more than she had intended to say, and also, she recognized, the truest thing she could have said. He nodded slowly. He did not try to tell her that was enough or that it was good or any of the other things people said to make the teller of a hard truth feel better. He just received it and sat with it, and that steadiness was more comfort than anything else could have been. "I am going to tell you something," he said, and his voice was careful and quiet and precise. "And I am telling you so that you can do whatever you want with it, because I am not asking for anything in return." He paused. "I have not met many people in my life who were genuinely themselves all the time. Most people are performing something, and there is nothing wrong with that. It is just how things are. But you are not performing anything. You are exactly what you are, and that is the most remarkable thing I have encountered in longer than I can remember." Rosa did not say anything. She looked at her coffee cup. "That is all," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She sat with this for a while. The town moved around them. The night air was warm and smelled of dust and cattle, and the faint sweetness of the wildflowers that still bloomed on the edges of the roads. "I am afraid," she said finally, "of trusting this, of trusting anything like this again." She said it plainly because he had offered plainness and she could match it. "I want you to understand that, not as a door closing, but as a truth." "I understand it," he said quietly, "and I am not in a hurry." She looked at him then fully, and what she saw in his face was precisely what he had said. No performance, no angle, no calculation about what he would get from this conversation. Just a man sitting with her on a step in a small Texas town, telling her the truth and asking nothing. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For being exactly what you appear to be," she said. "That is rarer than you might know." He smiled at that slowly, and the warmth of it reached all the way into her and settled there like something solid. "I am going to try to keep deserving that," he said. They sat on the step until the night grew cooler, and she did not feel afraid the way she usually felt afraid in the dark, and she noticed this and held it carefully and let it matter. The land commissioner's response came 9 days later, and it was better than any of them had hoped. The documented incidents, combined with the clear legitimacy of Thomas's claim, and what Caldwell described as a compelling letter of character from the county's other small landholders, produced an official inquiry into Brecker's conduct that was announced publicly and posted on the notice board outside the sheriff's office. Harlan Brecker was a pragmatic man, which meant he was a man who knew when a fight had become more expensive than the outcome was worth. The railroad spur's route had already been finalized elsewhere in its path, and the particular 40 acres he wanted to push through had lost some of its immediate strategic value now that the inquiry was public. He did not withdraw gracefully, because men like Brecker did not do things gracefully, but he withdrew. His men stopped appearing on Main Street. The pressure on Thomas and me stopped. Thomas went out the following Saturday morning and repaired his well and rebuilt the fence post and planted a new row of tomatoes in the kitchen garden to replace the ones that had been trampled. Me stood on the porch and watched him work, with her hand resting on the curve of her belly, and when Rosa visited that afternoon she found them both quietly incandescent with relief. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Me held on and said, into her hair, "Thank you. You did this." "Stephen and Caldwell did this," Rosa said. "You started it," me said firmly. "You sat down across from him and asked for help. That is also a kind of courage, Rosa. That is the kind you had to learn." Rosa thought about this as she walked back to town, the late afternoon light pressing long shadows across the road and the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts on either side. She thought about what kind of courage it was, the kind you had to learn, the kind that did not come naturally because the world had spent time teaching you lessons that ran opposite to it. She had learned to keep herself closed, to be competent and quiet, and to manage everything within her own resources. She had learned this because the alternative had at one point left her with nothing. But there was a different kind of closed. She was beginning to understand. There was the closed that was protection and the closed that was a prison, and they felt very similar from the inside, and the difference between them was what you were protecting yourself from. If what you were protecting yourself from was everything, then it was not protection anymore. It was just isolation with good reasons. She thought about this for the rest of the walk. She thought about it through supper service. She thought about it while she was lying in her room that night, and by the time the hotel was fully quiet around her, she had arrived at something that felt like clarity. She was going to stop pretending that she did not want this. Stephen came in for breakfast the following morning, which was unusual because his typical pattern was the evening meal. He was wearing a clean shirt, and he looked slightly less certain than he usually looked, which she noticed in the way you notice things when you have been paying close attention to someone. He sat at his corner table and she brought him coffee without being asked, and when she set it down he said, "I have been offered a position." She sat down across from him, which was now a thing she did, and he looked pleased at this in the quiet way he looked pleased at things. "Where?" she asked. "The Maddox Ranch wants a permanent foreman," he said. "The man they had is moving his family north to Kansas. The position is steady work, better pay, and I would be staying in Dusty Creek." He looked at his coffee cup. "I have not given them an answer yet." She looked at him. "Why not?" He looked up at her. The directness of his gaze held what she had now come to understand was his particular quality, that complete absence of pretense. "Because I wanted to tell you about it first," he said. Her heart did something complicated. "Why did you want to tell me?" "Because you matter to me," he said simply. "And the decision to stay here is related to that in a way that feels important to be honest about." Rosa Callahan, who had spent the better part of 6 months rebuilding walls and the better part of the last 2 months finding them less functional than she had designed them to be, looked at the man across from her and felt the last of the mortar crumble. "Take the position," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yeah." "Yes," she said, and for the record, she looked at him with the same directness she had learned to expect from him. "You matter to me also." The slow warmth of his smile moved across his face, and it was such an honest and unguarded expression of happiness that it made her heart ache in the best possible way. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed, and went to refill his coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. They moved carefully through the weeks that followed, which was the right pace for them, and they both seemed to understand this without it needing to be discussed. He took the foreman position at the Maddox Ranch and moved out of the boarding house into the small foreman's cottage at the edge of the ranch property. And his days took on a different structure, longer and more physically demanding. And he came into town on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Sunday afternoons. Tuesday and Thursday evenings he came to the Creek House for supper, and on Sunday afternoons he called on Rosa properly, with his hat in hand, and they went walking along the creek path that gave the town its name. Or if the weather was too harsh for walking, they sat in the hotel's small parlor and talked for hours. He told her about growing up on the farm outside San Antonio, about a mother who grew roses along every fence line and a father who was stern in the week, but sang hymns on Sunday mornings with what Stephen called an alarming amount of enthusiasm. He told her about the years of cattle work, the long silent months on the trail, the particular way solitude changed a person's relationship to noise and crowds. He told her about the things he wanted, which were specific and moderate and real. A piece of land of his own, a purpose that was his, people around him who mattered. She told him things in return, carefully at first and then less carefully, which was itself a kind of measure of how far she had come. She told him about her own childhood in Kansas, about a mother who was resourceful and practical and a father who died of fever when she was 12 and left them to manage. And they had managed. She told him about meeting Gerald at 20, when she was still young enough to believe that a man's charm was an indication of his character. She told him about the homestead years, the hard work and the things she had been proud of, the garden she had planted and the chickens she had kept, and the sunsets she had watched from the porch of a house she had thought was going to be permanent. She did not tell him this without cost, but she told him, and he received every word with the same careful attention he gave to everything. And when she was done, he did not try to fix it or minimize it or replace it with something more comfortable. He just said, "You have built things before, good things, things worth being proud of." "Yes," she said. "You can build them again," he said. "Different things, better ones maybe." She looked at him across the small parlor table in the late afternoon light and felt the weight of the last 2 years shift on her shoulders, not disappear, because it did not disappear, but become something she was carrying rather than something that was carrying her. "I am beginning to believe that," she said. July was magnificent and ferocious, the heat pressing down on the Texas plains with the total commitment of a summer that intended to be taken seriously. The wildflowers had burned off, and the grass had gone gold, and the creek ran lower and clearer over its limestone bed. And Dusty Creek sat in the middle of it all and sweated and endured and carried on. Me's pregnancy was going well, to the evident relief of everyone. She had slowed down somewhat, which for me meant she was moving at the pace of a normal, energetic person, and she had handed more of the kitchen work at the hotel over to Rosa and the part-time cook named Harriet, and she sat more and fussed over Thomas and sang to herself in the afternoons. Rosa had become, over these months, genuinely happy, which was a state she recognized in herself with some surprise, as though she had not quite expected to find it here. She was happy in the Creek house with me and the work. She was happy in Dusty Creek, which had revealed itself to be a town with real character beneath its dust-coated exterior. She was happy in a way that was specifically and unmistakably connected to Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Sunday afternoons. On a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of July, Stephen took her to a spot along the creek he had found on one of his rides, a wide flat limestone shelf where the water ran shallow over smooth stones, and the cottonwoods made a canopy overhead that turned the light green and cool. He had brought a cloth and a picnic that he had assembled with evident care, cold sliced beef and corn bread and peaches from the general store, and they sat on the limestone and ate and listened to the water and talked until the shadow of the cottonwoods lengthened across the ground. At some point the conversation lapsed into comfortable quiet, and Rosa was watching the water when Stephen said, quietly, "I love you, Rosa." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at the water anymore. He was looking at her, and his face held everything she had come to know of him, the honesty and the warmth and the steadiness that did not require anything from her to sustain itself. She felt the truth of her own response rise in her simply and completely, without the tangled qualifications she might have expected. She felt it the way you felt your feet on solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. "I love you," she said. "I have been loving you since before I was ready to admit it, which was an uncomfortable situation that I am grateful to be past." He laughed, low and warm, and she laughed too, and then he reached across the limestone and took her hand in his large, rough one, and she let him, and they sat there in the cottonwood shade with the creek running over the stones and the afternoon holding very still and very golden around them. It was the first time in longer than she could calculate that she had felt genuinely, completely safe. Not safe because nothing could happen. She understood well enough that things happened in this world regardless of what you hoped, but safe in the way that mattered, which was the way of being known and valued and chosen, and knowing that the person who had done the knowing and valuing and choosing was someone whose word and whose character she trusted without reservation. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a quiet gesture that was somehow more moving than anything more elaborate would have been. They stayed by the creek until the sun was low and walked back to town in the long evening light, and at the door of the hotel he stopped and looked at her with his hat in his hand and the warm, settling dark around them. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "formally, with every intention of being permanent if you are willing." She looked at him for a moment. The word permanent had a long history in her, and most of its chapter headings were not good ones. But she looked at Stephen Wells in the evening light, and understood the difference between a word said by someone building towards something real, and the same word said by someone using it as a temporary structure. "I am willing," she said. His smile was slow and absolutely genuine, and she committed every detail of it to memory. August arrived, and with it the particular golden weight of a summer nearing its end. The Maddox Ranch was in its busiest season, and Stephen's days were long and physical, and he arrived at the Creek House on Tuesdays and Thursdays with the particular tiredness of someone who had spent themselves honestly on a day's work. Rosa found that she liked this, liked the specific realness of it, the mud on his boots and the calluses on his hands, and the way he ate her food with unself-conscious appreciation. She had begun cooking for him, which was something she had not told anyone she was doing, but which me had figured out within a week, and had commented on by squeezing her arm and saying nothing, which was its own complete communication. She made the things she made well, which were the dishes she had learned from her mother in Kansas, and the things she had added over years of feeding herself and, briefly, a husband who turned out not to deserve it. Beef and root vegetable stew that took the better part of an afternoon, corn bread with just enough sweetener, dried cherry preserves on biscuits that she now had the kitchen resources at the Creek House to make properly. Stephen ate everything she put in front of him with the attentiveness of someone who understood that food made with care was itself a form of communication, and he thanked her every time in a way that was specific rather than general, noting what he liked about each thing, and she understood that this was him telling her he was paying attention. On an August evening thick with the smell of coming rain, he came in later than usual, and his face held something she had not seen in it before, a quality of restraint over something that was pushing against it, and she brought his coffee and sat across from him and waited. "My mother wrote," he said. "She is not well. She has been having difficulties with her lungs since the spring. My sister thinks I ought to come." Rosa was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of this. "How far is your sister?" "Memphis," he said. "Tennessee." She looked at him. The distance was considerable, and the journey was no small thing. "How long would you be gone?" "I do not know," he said, and there was a careful quality to his voice that she recognized as a man not wanting to put his uncertainty on her. "A month, perhaps more, depending on how she is." "You should go," Rosa said. He looked at her. "I know. I want to be sure you understand, Stephen." She said his name firmly, and he stopped. "Your mother is ill and your family needs you. There is nothing to work out here. You go, and I will be here when you come back, and that is the whole of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the relief move through him, and beneath the relief something that was almost undone by her certainty. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "I am practical," she corrected. "And I am not going anywhere. This is my town now." He reached across the table and took her hand, there in the Creek House dining room in the evening, without any particular subtlety, and she let him, and the warmth of it spread all through her. He left 3 days later on the eastbound stage, with his hat and his saddle bag, and a letter she had written him that she had pressed into his hand at the stage stop, and told him to read on the road. She had written it plainly and without flourish, telling him that she was not afraid of waiting, and that she trusted him completely, and that she expected him to write and expected those letters to be long enough to be worth the postage. He laughed when she told him that part, and he kissed her for the first time right there at the stage stop with several people watching, which was not at all the kind of thing she had imagined but turned out to be exactly right, warm and deliberate and without any hurry. And when he pulled back he said, "I will write you very long letters," and climbed into the stage. She watched it roll out of town and then went back to work because work was what she did, and it helped, and she was not a woman who stood at windows. He wrote long letters. He wrote her about Memphis, which was a shock after Texas, green and humid and architecturally overwhelming after years of the flat, spare clarity of the plains. He wrote about his mother, who was more frail than the letters had prepared him for, but who had her own particular fierceness, and was fighting the lung trouble with the stubbornness of a woman who had not finished doing what she wanted. He wrote about his sister Margaret, who was practical and funny, and who had apparently taken one look at his letters to Rosa, and told him that he had better not waste time because a woman like that was not the kind to wait indefinitely, which Rosa found absolutely charming when he reported it. She wrote back in equal length. She told him about me, whose pregnancy had reached its final triumphant stage and who was luminous with it in the way of some women. She told him about Thomas, who had finished the new bedroom and had begun building a cradle of such meticulous beauty that it had made me cry for 20 minutes when she first saw it. She told him about the hotel and the small dramas of the town, and the way the late summer heat had broken in September into the kind of Texas autumn that made you understand why people stayed. She told him she missed him in the plain-spoken way she had learned to say true things to him, without apology or diminishment. She told him she was glad he was there with his mother, and that she looked forward to knowing him even better when he came back, which was its own kind of promise. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that waiting was not what she had feared it would be. She was not the woman she had been in January, white-knuckled and certain that anything given could be taken and anything loved could be lost. She had not arrived at the uncomplicated optimism of someone who had never been hurt. She had arrived somewhere else, somewhere that understood both things, that loss was possible and that it did not make love inadvisable, and that the specific man she was waiting for was worth every ordinary day of the waiting. Me's son was born on a bright Thursday in October, when the sky was so blue it looked like someone had set it behind glass, and the cottonwoods along the creek were all turning gold. They named him James Thomas, for Thomas's father, and he was pink and furious and entirely perfect. And Rosa held him in the rocking chair in Me's bedroom, while Thomas sat on the edge of the bed beside me and looked at his wife and his son, with an expression of such transparent love that Rosa had to look at the baby, instead, because Thomas's face was almost too much to witness. She wrote to Stephen that same afternoon, and she said, among other things, "I held a newborn today, and it was the most ordinary miracle I have ever encountered. I think I understand now why people keep doing this despite all evidence that the world is difficult, because the world is also, apparently, full of this." He wrote back 5 days later, "I am going to come home soon. My mother is improving and Margaret has things in hand. But mostly I am coming home because I read that sentence about ordinary miracles and I knew I could not stay away any longer." He arrived on a Tuesday in November, on the late afternoon stage, and she was watching from the Creek House window because she had not been able to help it. And she saw him climb down from the stage with his saddle bag and his hat, and the particular quality of a man who had been traveling long and hard and was very glad to be done. She went out the front door of the hotel and across the street without entirely deciding to, and he turned and saw her, and the smile that broke across his face was the most purely joyful thing she had ever seen on a person. And she covered the distance between them, and he put his arms around her, and held her there in the middle of the road, with the stage horses stamping behind him and the people of Dusty Creek moving around them. And she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him and thought, this is what safe feels like. This, right here. He stayed for a long time and then pulled back just enough to look at her and said, "Hello, Rosa Callahan." "Hello, Stephen Wells," she said. "Welcome home." November in Dusty Creek was quieter than the burning months had been, the pace of the town settling into a different rhythm, the afternoons shorter and the air carrying the first real chill of the approaching winter. The Maddox Ranch had its own seasonal slowdown, and Stephen had more evenings free, and Rosa found that having more time with him was even better than she had imagined during the months of letters. They spent their evenings in the hotel parlor or walking when the weather allowed or, on the evenings when Me insisted on feeding people, around the table in the small house east of town, while James slept in the cradle Thomas had built. They talked about things large and small, the ordinary maintenance of two lives moving through the same world, and Rosa marveled sometimes at how natural it felt, how entirely without the jagged edges of effort. On a clear, cold Sunday afternoon in December, with a thin, sharp sky overhead and their breath making small clouds in the air, Stephen took her back to the limestone shelf by the creek where they had sat in the July heat, and the world looked entirely different there in the winter light, the cottonwoods bare and silver, the water very clear and quiet, the stone cold and pale. He had something in his coat pocket. She had not noticed it until he reached into it and held out a ring that was simple and unelaborate, a silver band with a small turquoise stone set in it, the turquoise, that particular shade of blue-green that was native to this part of Texas. "I found the stone outside of El Paso on a cattle drive 3 years ago," he said. "I have been carrying it around with the idea that someday it ought to be something. I had a silversmith in Memphis put it in the band while I was there, because I had figured out by then what the someday was." He looked at her directly, steadily, with everything he was on his face. "I am not asking you to make a promise you are not ready to make. I am asking you whether you want to make this one." "Because I want to make mine." Rosa looked at the ring in his hand and then at his face and felt the entire distance from January to December compress into this moment, all the miles and all the months and all the rebuilding, and she felt the absolute rightness of where she was standing. "Yes," she said, "I want to make that promise." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she looked at it against the winter landscape, the blue-green stone against her skin, and thought that it was exactly right, something found in this wild, beautiful country and made into something that would last. He cupped her face in his cold, rough hands and kissed her there by the winter creek under the bare cottonwoods, and she kissed him back with everything she had, without reserve, without held breath, without the flinching quality of someone waiting for the other shoe. And when they pulled apart, she laughed from the sheer joy of it, and he laughed too, and the sound of them went out across the cold, clear water and the pale stones and the winter-stripped trees, and disappeared into the enormous, quiet sky. They married in February, on a Saturday when the winter was still present but had softened enough to promise the spring underneath it. The church with the crooked steeple was filled, which surprised Rosa until she thought about it and understood that in the months since she had arrived in Dusty Creek, she had become part of this place in ways she had not tracked, through the creek house and through Me, and through the ordinary daily accumulation of being a person in a town. Me stood beside her as her witness, with James in Thomas's arms in the first pew, and Stephen's friend from the Maddox Ranch, a lanky Texan named Cal, stood beside him and looked proud enough to burst his buttons. Attorney Caldwell had come back through town on business and was sitting in the third row with an expression of genuine pleasure. Old Herb sat in the back row with his bad ears and probably heard about 20% of the ceremony, but clapped with enthusiasm at the right moments. The minister was a young man who had arrived in Dusty Creek the previous fall, and who read the words with genuine feeling, and without the mechanical quality that made some ceremonies feel like paperwork. When he asked Stephen if he would take Rosa as his wife, Stephen looked at her and said, "I will," with such calm and complete certainty that Rosa felt it all the way to the floor. When he asked Rosa the same question, she looked back at the man she had not expected to fall for and said, "I will," with all the weight of someone who understood what a promise was and had chosen this one with her whole self. After the ceremony, me hosted dinner at the Creek House, which was closed for the day and transformed with whatever decorations me had been secretly engineering for the past month. Wildflowers that had been dried and hung in bunches from the ceiling, candles everywhere, the long table set for the assembled company, and the kitchen producing an embarrassment of good food. Stephen sat beside Rosa at the head of the table and held her hand whenever he was not using it for eating, and she let him, and the room was full of the warmth of people genuinely glad for the occasion. Thomas gave a toast that was brief and heartfelt and made me cry, and Cal gave one that was considerably longer and funnier, and made everyone else cry from laughing, and Rosa leaned against Stephen's shoulder at the table, and felt the particular pleasure of a happiness that had been earned and understood its own worth. They went home that evening to the foreman's cottage at the Maddox Ranch, which Stephen had spent the past 2 months expanding and improving into something that had a real kitchen and a parlor and a bedroom and enough room to grow. He had put a porch on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and on the porch he had built a bench, and before they went inside they sat on it for a while and looked at the Texas evening around them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the last light on the flat horizon, at the enormous sky that Texas wore like it was born to it. She thought about Kansas and a burned homestead and the long road to this porch, and she thought about what it meant to be where she was. "I am thinking that this is it," she said, "the thing I did not know I was looking for." He put his arm around her, and she settled into the warmth of him with the ease of something completely right. "Me too," he said. Spring of 1883 came in with a particular exuberance, and Rosa found herself falling in love with the landscape around the Maddox Ranch in the same way she had fallen in love with many things in the past year, slowly and with accumulating evidence. The cottage was more of a home every week, as she added to it the things she knew how to make and chose, curtains and preserves and a kitchen garden that was her particular pride, started from seed in February, and now showing brave green shoots in the March soil. She and me saw each other several times a week, the geography of their lives intersecting comfortably, and James was growing at the startling rate of all young things, and had developed a habit of staring at Stephen with intense brown eyes whenever he visited, which Stephen found enormously entertaining. Stephen would hold James and the baby would regard him with solemnity, and then, when something pleased him, produce a smile of the sudden total variety, and Rosa would watch the two of them and feel something in her chest that was becoming familiar as the specific warmth of knowing what you love. She found out she was expecting in May. She told Stephen on a Tuesday evening on the south porch in the last of the day's light, saying it plainly because she was a woman who said things plainly, and because she wanted to see his face when she did. His face was extraordinary. It moved through surprise into something that was so purely and completely joy that she could not look at it directly for a moment, and then he reached for her and held her with such care and such feeling that she pressed her face against his chest and felt tears on her own cheeks that she had not known were coming. "A baby," he said, into her hair. "A baby," she agreed. He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling? What do you need?" "I am well," she said, laughing slightly at the sequence. "I am very well. I feel mostly the same except that biscuits smell different to me now, which I understand is temporary." "Whatever you need," he said. "You," she said simply. "That is what I need." He kissed her in the evening air, and the spring moved around them with its smell of new growth and its promise of everything coming, and Rosa Callahan, who had ridden into Dusty Creek on a wagon with nothing but her cousin's address and a solemn promise she no longer needed to keep, felt the specific and complete happiness of a woman who had found her home. Their son was born in January of 1884, on a night when the Texas stars were so thick and clear overhead that Stephen said the sky looked like scattered salt on black velvet, which was the most poetic thing she had ever heard him say, and which she told him so. They named him William, for no particular reason except that they both liked it, and he arrived with a set of lungs that made his opinion of the world immediately apparent and dark hair that already had a tendency to curl. Stephen held him that first night in the lamplight of the cottage bedroom, this man who rode cattle and fixed fence lines and stood beside people who needed standing beside, this man who was exactly what he appeared to be, and he looked down at William with an expression that Rosa would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man encountering his own capacity for love in a size he had not previously known. He looked up at her over the baby's head and said simply, "Thank you." She was tired in the way that was complete and profound and also entirely worth it. "You helped," she said. He laughed softly, careful of the sleeping baby, and came and sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned against him, and they both looked at this person they had made together, small and perfect and entirely real. The years in Dusty Creek were good years, full and textured and genuine. The Maddox Ranch prospered under Stephen's steady foreman work, and by 1885 he had saved enough to make a down payment on 40 acres adjacent to the ranch property that the owner had decided to sell. He brought the deed home and laid it on the kitchen table, and Rosa ran her hands over it with the care of someone who understood what land could mean, what it could be taken away, and what it could be built into when it was truly yours. They built on those 40 acres over the following years, adding to what was already there, improving the cottage to a proper house with more rooms as their family grew. Their daughter Clara came in 1886, with Rosa's green eyes and Stephen's brown hair, and from the moment she could sit up, she had an opinion about everything and expressed it with volume and confidence. Clara and William grew up in the Texas sunlight, running wild on the 40 acres and helping with the kitchen garden, and learning the names of the horses and growing into people of such clear good character that Rosa sometimes looked at them and felt the precise quality of having made something that mattered. Me and Thomas's family grew too. James joined by a sister named Ruth in 1885, and the two families wove themselves into the fabric of each other's lives in the way of people who chose each other long ago and kept on choosing. Attorney Caldwell sent a letter in the spring of 1887 to inform them that Harlan Brecker had sold his operation and retired to San Antonio due to failing health, and that the new owners of the Brecker land were a family from Colorado who by all accounts were decent people and had already made friendly introductions to the county's other landholders. Rosa read this at the kitchen table and then handed it to Stephen and said nothing, and he read it and set it down, and they exchanged the look of two people who had been through something and had come out the other side of it intact. In 1888, Stephen's mother came to visit, traveling with Margaret and Margaret's husband, and stayed for a month in the house where the guest room had been built precisely against this kind of contingency. His mother was smaller than Rosa had imagined and had eyes exactly like Stephen's, and she looked at the house and the children and Rosa herself with those eyes and then took Rosa's hands in both of hers and said, "You are everything he wrote that you were, and I am glad you let him in." Rosa looked at this woman and thought about what she might have said in the January she had arrived in Dusty Creek, the version of herself who had made a solemn promise and intended to honor it, and she thought about how entirely wrong she would have been, not about Gerald, not about what she had come from, but about what she was capable of and what she deserved. "I am glad I did too," she said, and she meant it with everything she had. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1889, Rosa sat on the south porch of the house on their 40 acres while Stephen worked in the near pasture with William, showing the boy something about fence repair that William was at 7 years old deeply serious about learning. Clara was inside with a library book she had brought home from the school in town, and the afternoon was the particular kind of golden, and still that October in Texas sometimes offered, as though the world had paused to let itself be appreciated. Rosa had her mending in her lap, but she had stopped working it. She was looking at the pasture, at the man and the boy bent over the fence post together, at the way Stephen was explaining something with patient hands, and William was listening with that focused intensity he had always had. She was listening to the sound of Clara reading aloud softly to herself inside, a habit she had that Rosa adored. She was feeling the October warmth on her face and smelling the dry grass and the specific clean smell of the land they owned, genuinely owned, without debt or doubt. She thought about the woman she had been 7 years ago, driving a wagon alone across 200 miles of Texas scrubland with a solemn promise and a heart like cracked prairie earth. She thought about that woman with a tenderness that was honest and without pity, because that woman had been doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was keep herself intact and keep moving. She thought about the man who had come into the Creek house for supper on a dusty evening and told her the truth without being asked, and had not been in any hurry, and had stood beside people who needed standing beside simply because it was right. She thought about the limestone shelf by the creek and the turquoise ring and the crooked steepled church and the February wedding, and every Tuesday and Thursday evening and Sunday afternoon that had built, accumulation by accumulation, into this life. She thought about safety and what it meant. It did not mean nothing could happen. It did not mean the world was without difficulty or that the years ahead would be uncomplicated. It meant that whatever came, there was a person beside her who was exactly who he appeared to be, and she was exactly who she was, and they had chosen each other with full knowledge and complete intention, and that choosing was renewed every ordinary day by the way they lived. She heard the gate on the pasture fence and looked up, and Stephen was coming toward the porch with William running ahead of him, and the boy hit the porch steps and came to her with his hands full of something he wanted to show her, a particular kind of rock he had found at the fence post that he was certain was significant, and she held it and turned it and told him it was very fine, and he ran back inside to show Clara. And Stephen came up the steps and sat on the bench beside her with the tired satisfaction of a good afternoon's work. He looked at her looking at him. "What?" he said, smiling. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He took her hand, the one with the turquoise ring, and held it on his knee in the October afternoon. "Everything," he agreed. The ranch and the house and the children and the life continued to grow and shift and deepen in the way of things that are well-rooted. William turned 8 and 9 and 10, and showed Stephen's particular gift for practicality and his mother's green eyes, and Clara turned 5 and 6 and 7, and showed Rosa's capacity for directness and Stephen's warmth, and the 40 acres held them all and became more itself with every season. Rosa kept her kitchen garden with the attention of someone who understood that growing things were a daily renewal of the same basic commitment, that you put care in and attended to it, and it returned itself to you transformed. She canned and preserved and cooked in the way that was native to her, and the kitchen of the house was the warm center of their lives in the way that kitchens are when they are properly inhabited. Stephen rode with William when the boy was old enough, teaching him the work that had been his own life before this life, and there was something in this continuance that Rosa recognized as a kind of rightness, the way that certain things pass from person to person and are thereby kept alive. In 1891, me and Rosa sat on me's porch one afternoon while the children played in the yard and Thomas worked in his workshop and the late summer turned around them, and me said, "Do you remember what I told you about good things that first week you were here?" Rosa looked at her. "That I was allowed to have them." "Yes," me said. "Do you believe it now?" Rosa looked at the yard where Clara was chasing James, and William was trying to explain the rules of something to Ruth with the patient condescension of an older child, and at the workshop where Thomas's hammer made its steady sound, and at the road that led back to the house on the 40 acres, where the life she had built with Stephen Wells was waiting with all its ordinary daily wonder. "Yes," she said, "I believe it now." Me smiled at her with the warmth of a woman who had always known this would be true. "Good," she said. Rosa Callahan, who was now Rosa Wells and had been Rosa Wells for 9 years, who had come into a dusty Texas town on a broken-hearted promise, and had found instead a whole new understanding of what she was capable of and what she was worth, looked at the afternoon and at her cousin and at the life around her, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth after a long cold. She had not expected Stephen Wells. She had not expected any of it. She had expected to work and keep her head down, and manage, and be fine in the controlled and careful way of someone protecting themselves from the thing they most wanted. What she had found instead was the thing itself, the real version, the one that did not ask her to be small or be afraid or pretend, the one that stood beside her in the full daylight of who she was and loved her for exactly that. The first man who had ever made her feel genuinely safe. Not safe from everything, but safe in the way that counted. Safe enough to be herself. Safe enough to grow. That was the promise she had not known she was waiting for someone to make. And he had made it not in words alone, but in every Tuesday evening and every patient hour and every steady ordinary day. In the way that real promises are made, by being kept. She sat on me's porch and watched the children in the yard and the afternoon going gold around the edges. And she was, without any qualification or reservation, deeply and completely happy. And the Texas sky went on being enormous overhead, and the land went on being vast and beautiful and difficult and full of possibility, and Dusty Creek went on being a town in the process of becoming something. And the Wells family on their 40 acres went on being the thing they had built together, which was the most specific and irreplaceable and wonderful kind of thing there was. Home.